Bonjour, je me présente, Marie-André Lamontagne. Bienvenue au Festival littéraire international Metropolis bleu, qui connaît maintenant sa 23e édition. La programmation du festival 2021 au printemps 2021 a pour thème principal les défis de notre temps, avec le point d'interrogation, important le point d'interrogation. Et sur ce thème, la programmation réunit des écrivains, des penseurs et propose une cinquantaine d'événements en format virtuel, pandémie oblige. And one of the topics addressed by our program is called slow. Slow for green, slow for ecology, slow for decluttering, slow for slowness. Et un qui s'y connaît un peu en matière de lenteur est le journaliste canadien, auteur et conférencier Carl Honoré, auteur du best-seller Éloge de la lenteur. That book, In Praise of Slow, its original title, examines our compulsion to hurry and chronicles a global trend toward putting on the brakes. Carl Honoré is also the author of other books. For instance, his second book, Under Pressure, explores the good, the bad, and the ugly of modern child rearing. His third book, The Slow Fix, explores how, how to tackle complex problems in every walk of life, from health and relationships to business and politics. And his latest book, Bolder, Making the Most of Our Longer Lives, is about aging, how we can do it better and feel better about doing it. Tous les livres de Carl Honoré sont traduits en français, je le précise. Before spearheading the slow movement, he spent a decade working as a journalist. He is an award-winning writer, a broadcaster and TED speaker. Il vit à Londres. Alors, on a conçu la formule suivante. 3 personnes issues de 3 milieux différents poseront leurs questions à Carl Honoré plutôt qu'un seul intervieweur. Ça va introduire de la variété. On aime la variété, nous, à Metropolis bleu. Et leurs questions seront en fonction de leurs préoccupations et de leur centre d'intérêt. 3 milieux différents, l'éducation, l'entrepreneurship et la culture. Chacune, car il s'agit de 3 femmes que je vous présenterai à mesure, mènera l'échange pendant une quinzaine de minutes, 17 très exactement selon notre planning, mais on pourra aller jusqu'à 18 peut-être. Les échanges auront lieu tantôt en anglais, tantôt en français, selon l'interlocutrice, et Carl Honoré répondra à l'avenant. Donc, on commence. First stop, first Q&R, education, with Catherine Nikidis. Recognized as an educational leader in Montreal, Catherine Nikidis is currently head at the Trafalgar School for Girls, following many years in both teaching and leadership roles at other independent and public schools. She has shared compelling stories and provided experience-based insights on how to educate girls and young women for lives of leadership and purpose in talks to organizations like the McGill Women's Alumni Association and the Women's Canadian Club. Catherine Nikidis, Carl Honoré, we are listening to you.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for having us today. It's just such a pleasure to be here. And Carl, I've completely enjoyed your book. I love how you start off where your inspiration was really bedtime stories for your children. And of course, that completely resonated with me. And any reference to the Jetsons just makes me read any kind of book. So I love the whole thing. Of course, I literally have just gotten off a retreat with heads of school in Montreal, independent school heads in Montreal, and talking about, well-being and the notion of what happens post-COVID and how do we approach learning and education post-COVID in an era where we've now kind of we're quite excited at the beginning of COVID to see a little bit of a slowing in pace. Actually, we were, that we had that joy, and then how we very quickly, adapted and came back up to quick pace with technology integrated into our school lives. And so, as we look at this, I know as independent schools, as heads of schools, as parents, we're all looking at our children and saying, what's next, and how do we use this kind of notion of the slow movement post-COVID? I mean, and I say post-COVID because I guess when I prepared these questions, I had hoped that we'd be post-COVID when we were talking. I was hopeful, but in the years and months to come, I'm just curious to know how you think this shift is going to happen, and what are some of the things we can do to do it intentionally, kind of take us, as opposed to letting COVID decide what we do, but intentionally kind of make a shift for kids.
Thanks. Well, one thing I do a lot of work with schools around the world and so on. And so one thing that we've been doing along the way, and I think you're right to be cautious about saying post-COVID, because I think we're probably not quite out of it yet. So this is something that if a school hasn't done it, I think it could even think about doing it now, is to keep a record of what has worked in the moment. Because I think very often you talked about some of the slowing down and how, and I think a lot of schools found that some of that brought benefits and was a good thing. But then very quickly circumstances kick in, the context changes, and then whoosh, you're off again. And you've forgotten really what it was. You have a vague memory of slowing down and that it seemed reasonably okay, or it brought some upsides. And I think a really useful thing is to keep a kind of a collective and a personal record of what worked along the way, both as teachers, as a staff together, individually teachers, staff together, the school, pupils, whether that's a reflection journals or keeping little videos to talk about what you liked about the new balance between a screen learning and off-screen learning. It's just to keep it alive in people's memories, so that later on when we do come out, we don't just go back into the old ways. It's so easy to snap back into the old ways of doing things. So I think that's one way to hang on to some of the good stuff. I think also, as we've pinpointed along the way, some of the good aspects of SLO that have occurred over this year. I mean, you hear from a lot of teachers, and this varies from classroom to classroom and school to school, but many will have had the experience of maybe having a bit more time with their students, getting to know them a little bit better, some of the things that are going on in their homes, which affect the way they arrive at school that day. And then also the pupils themselves at home, having maybe more time with their families, doing things together as a family that aren't for a resume or a Harvard application, but are just simply about being together and doing things. And I think it's important to try and remember, and not only to remember those things, but to cherish them. So often in the schooling system, what we reward is exam scores. That's the one thing we have a metric for. So one thing I've seen work really well is schools having things, and can do this as a school or as a community, is to keep a SLO scorecard, so that a child has a way of, ticking. This week I had 4 family dinners, right? With the TV switched off. Or this week I had 3 conversations with a friend where we really, had one of those conversations we'll remember for a very long time. Or, this day I walked, to school when normally I would drive, and just to keep those, whether it's on the fridge or it can be even a video, just something that just keeps it, because metrics is a problematic thing. And the trouble with targets, as we know, especially in education, is that the target can become a more important than the thing it's measuring. So we don't want the SLO scorecard to become that. But I think it does help to create a kind of framework and an architecture and a structure, a memory palace almost for what we've liked, and also to encourage people to cultivate and have more of it. So those are some things I would suggest for trying to tease out what was good and carry it forward when things go back to being a bit more like what we used to call normal.
Well, I love that notion of kind of that very intentional method of scorecard to be able to kind of address it. And I think that's the beauty of your book, is that very humanistic approach to SLO, or to making shift or change. And I know Thomas Friedman wrote the book "Thank You for Being Late," and it was really both of you encouraging that notion of pausing and reflecting and taking that time. And his approach was very much on the accelerators that are factors like technology and globalization and climate change. And I found your approach quite unique, because it was much more, and resonated with me in the sense of, it was much more humanistic. It was much more about the day to day. It was much more about the life. But as I was thinking of both books, I said, where do the two collide? How do we have like real systemic change happen? And then some of these amazing approaches that you have, the simplicity of a scorecard of, let's try and have 3 family dinners this week. And how do we do that? And do you have some thoughts about how the two can come together, and of course that's so important to me in terms of systemic change in education, and then the kind of the personal approaches that you're talking about in our day-to-day school lives. So I was wondering.
I mean, I think that there's the two flanks, if you like. There's the micro and the macro, or you call it, the big and the small, or the human and I think we need to be advancing on both fronts at the same time. And my way in is the personal, but obviously I'm couching it and talking a lot about the late capitalism and consumer culture. These things are all, you can't have a conversation about slowing down as a single person or an individual without anchoring it in a bigger talk about the other stuff. I think there's always a danger, especially with a movement like Slow, that it becomes a kind of solipsistic, self-serving, selfish, is it okay if I say something about the whole Goop and Gwyneth Paltrow? I mean, just something like that, right? That it becomes something along those lines where it's all about me. And ultimately Slow is about, of course it's about putting your own house in order, but often that's the starting point. The end point is all the connection that goes with it, right? Because slowing down allows you to listen, right? To hear and understand, and to bring people along with you, and to love, right? I mean, that's really what it all comes down to in the end, is to be and there's a wonderful African proverb which sums this up. It's, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And for me, that's sort of where those two things meet. And in a way, I think Friedman is coming to the same place from a different angle. I mean, he's more of a kind of macro policy guy, but we have to work, I think, individually. So that's all the things we can do ourselves in our own homes, our own families, our own communities, our own schools. But we also need to be lobbying hard, pushing hard for people, in government, right? We need to be leaning on the people who have their hands on the levers of power to reshape and reform and reframe the socioeconomic model, right? Because the model that we live in at the moment, sort of late capitalism, turbo consumerism, I mean, it's inimical to Slow, right? It runs completely against that grain. So we need to be moving on all different fronts. And I do think that's what happens naturally. I don't think, apart from maybe Gwyneth Paltrow, I think most people operate on the two planes at the same time. So I think it's very unusual for someone to slow down themselves and reconnect with their inner tortoise and get all that stuff right at home and not do anything, because I think once you do that, you see that you're part of, there's a bigger picture there, and that that being of service to other people is such a central part of a life well lived. And so I think it leads naturally on, and the two go hand in hand, I think, if you like.
Yeah, I think that I love that. I love the quote that you just said: if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. That's so beautiful. And I think that's post COVID. That's there is a far post COVID. We've been kind of racing ahead and doing it. So much of what we do, and I guess for perspective's sake, and I often I can imagine you probably speak to groups of parents. We definitely speak to groups of parents every day. And we look at kind of this, the pride that we take in now that our students, we wouldn't be able to enter into university programs now because our marks just wouldn't be high enough. And we kind of universities pride themselves, post-secondary education prides themselves on this, higher level that we keep on raising the bar, and that notion of just allowing our kids to be. As opposed to always trying to race ahead. Do you have some advice? I mean, as parents, and we talked a little bit about schools and keeping scorecards, but that notion of, a long time ago, school used to be about, I used to call it ABCs, but apprenticeship, A, apprenticeship, B, being, and C, really about connecting. And that's, I think, so much of why your book resonated with me. But how do we allow our students to be more, and our children to be more, as opposed to racing ahead with
Yeah, well, I think there's there's two ways to approach this. One is the actual things you do, and the other is, I think, a bigger picture, which is sort of reframing. And I'll start with the latter. It seems to me that the whole speed culture is about, it's globalization. It's that kind of the Silicon Valley, the tyranny of frictionlessness. Everything must be the same. It must move the throughput, go through very quickly. And what you end up with in a fast culture is you shave away the texture and the nuance and the rough edges, and you end up with one way of being, right? So you end up one definition of success, right? Success to parents looks one way, anything else is failure, right? If my child deviates from this one path to success, it's a hoodie, heroin, and homelessness, right? It's either that or Harvard, right? And it's like there's no middle ground. And I think that what you gain when you slow down, and the whole kind of slow philosophy, you bring a slow filter, you say there is a whole range, there's a rainbow of different paths for people to grow up and flourish and thrive and find their own way in the world and make a difference and live a life that they're going to be proud of living all the way through their lives. And so I think that's the reframing. What can you do to sort of break out of that stultifying model where parents, families think there's only one way to succeed and anything else is failure? I think one way, which I've seen work really well, is to tap into the alumni of schools a lot more. So I'm on the board. I've been working with a school for girls in New York City, right? And a big part of what they've tried to do to get away from this idea that there's only one way to succeed, and that's the kind of alpha track, right? Is to bring back alumni and get kids back in the school who've gone off and done all kinds of different things, right? And they'll come back and maybe some have gone to Harvard, but some will have, maybe become an artist, and someone's an architect, and someone is a nurse, and they come back and they talk about their story. They tell their journey, their path to where they are in their mid-20s. And the kids in the school see that and think, this child, this 20-something is they're luminous. They are a light. You can feel the fire in their belly, the joy, you hear it in their voice. And I think that's to have parents in the room at the same time is also tremendously powerful, because parents can then begin to imagine themselves outside this stifling box of conformity, right? Because this is what fast is. It's sort of, it's linked to the perfectionist culture, right? Where we feel we've got to have the perfect body, the perfect vacation, the perfect kitchen, the perfect child, right? Everything's got to be perfect. It's got to be one size fits all. And anything short or deviating from that is utter failure. The way to break that down is with stories, because as an educator, that the best way to unravel and unpack things for people is to tell them stories. And I think if you meet someone who's come out of that same school, especially, and gone off into a trajectory that never would have occurred to anyone, in maybe even in the careers development of that school, that opens another door. It opens up someone's vistas in a different way. So I think that's a really powerful way to do it. I think another way is coming back to that quote from Go Together and the African proverb, is to get children to, and this is moving away from the selfishness of speed, right? Because the speed, fast way of living is your to-do list. It's your resume. It's your one track. Slow is reconnecting. It's about being of service and helping. So I think volunteer work is such a crucial thing to bring into the equation. It's something I was lucky enough to do a bit of. I did the International Baccalaureate when I was at school in Edmonton. And that for me was life-changing. We had to do what was called CAS, a couple hours a week and it just it just widened out the horizon for me in ways that I never would have had before. And I think it just shows, it takes you out of yourself. This is what, again, the speed culture pushes you into yourself. It's what social media often does. It pushes you into judging yourself against an improbable and unattainable ideal. You get out into the world, you realize it's not all about you, right? It's about us. And volunteer work is a hugely potent way of doing that. So I think those are two things I would suggest as levers to pull in that front.
Well, thank you so much. That notion of both of that mentorship and having role models to look up to and hearing those stories and in community service are definitely key factors. And it's nice. I think as I kind of wrap up and say my thank you for this is, it's nice to know that I think the beauty of what I was reading through your work was this notion of we know this inherently, and then we get wrapped up, and that the points that you give us to remind us to go back to what we really know is for lack of a better term, the right way of living is just really beautiful gift. So thank you. Thanks very much for sharing.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been great to chat. And it's so true. We do know this. This is, although I feel sometimes I'm Sisyphus pushing a boulder up at the same time, I often feel like I'm pushing in an open door, right? Because we all have an inner tortoise. Yeah. We all understand what it is to slow down and the joy and the light that brings. And so it's there, right? It's there. It's just kind of getting over the taboo that often holds us back from putting on the brakes, because we feel shamed and guilty and embarrassed about slowing down because it's a 4-letter word in our culture, but we need it, right? It's there for all of us.
Absolutely. Keep reminding us. We need it.
Thanks.
Bien, merci à vous deux. Merci Catherine Mikidis. Question très précise aussi, intéressante. Second stop, the corporate world. Alors, Hélène Antoniou is an executive coach for corporate leaders and their teams, as well as family business owners and their successors. She is the author of Back to Beer and Hockey, the story of Eric Molson. This is a business biography of a father-in-law and past chairman of the Molson Coors Beverage Company, and it was published in 2018. She also lectures on family business, governance, and leadership. She is chair of the board of governors of Concordia University and a board member of Global Canada. Hélène Antoniou, Carl Honoré, we are listening to you.
Thank you, Marie. Carl, it's a pleasure to meet you. It's really a joy to be here with you and to hear what you have to say. I've read your big book, well, at least the first one, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And just like Kathy, who you spoke to before, it's the humanity that comes through in your work that is just really soothing and appealing and very attractive to me. Mary mentioned the book that I wrote, and one of the great learnings from that book that I worked on was to actually be near a leader like Eric Molson, who's someone who I think embodies the slow principle. In many ways, Eric Molson is someone who always worked for the long term. He was always a proponent of a business, of building a business that will last. He's now the 6th generation. His sons are the 7th generation of being in this family business. And their focus has always been that. And it's not only building a business for the long term, but building it for multiple stakeholders and not just shareholders. And as an executive coach, I hear many corporate leaders speaking about the importance of taking a long view, and yet they keep getting dragged back just because of the way our system works, of the pressures, especially for public corporations, the pressures of quarterly results, maximizing the share price now, and sometimes these leaders' actions don't match their intentions or their aspirations. And when I speak about this to either clients or colleagues, they do understand the value of taking things more slowly, to be present and aware and intentional of our actions. But given this pressure to deliver results, ASAP, they feel they can't act on it. I wonder what you'd recommend to them.
Sure. I'd recommend a few things. The first is I'd recommend they look at a Harvard Business Review article that investigated companies that embraced the slow philosophies, in other words, which took a sort of long-term view. And they found that these companies, their profits went up 40%, and I think the sales growth was up sort of 52% over a 3-year period. Now, that's not a massively long-term growth, but it's much longer vista than the quarterly report obsession that so many companies have nowadays. So I think the first thing I say, the Harvard Business Review example, that's one example, but again, it's sort of about telling stories. So it's about unearthing stories like the Molson chap you're referring to there, and putting those in front of people, because we're up against a wall of sound. We're up against a tsunami of media adulation of fast, right? So who gets all the column inches? It's Elon Musk, who tells us he sleeps in his factory and nobody ever changed the world working 40 hours a week, right? Those are the people that are held up on a pedestal. It's woven into business vernacular, right? Hustle. Everybody's got to hustle, right? And you snooze, you lose, lunches for wimps, all these phrases that we kind of throw around. I think, again, it's like what I was saying in the first segment, I think telling stories of the counterexamples that are out there is a hugely powerful way of getting people just to reset, pause, rethink, and maybe pivot to a different way of being. I think also in terms of long-term, it's important for an organization to set explicitly some kind of purpose. It sounds like a bit of a cheesy business word at the moment, but I think there is something in that, of having a kind of overarching mission that looks way beyond the next investor roll call or whatever. And just so you're creating different vantage points, different, North Stars, and that can start to help change some of the thinking, even in the today, right? As people are thinking, well, it's just, how much does what I do now or this week reflect against that longer term purpose, rather than how is it going to look in the next quarterly report? So I think that's important too. But I think you also need to rethink metrics as well. Actually to have concrete metrics that favor the long term over the short. So there's one example I think it was what was the name? It was Seidenberg, the guy from Verizon. I don't know, he who took Verizon to be this massive, multi-billion-dollar company, and instead of focusing ruthlessly on kind of short-term profit and so on, he created the metric of market growth and market share, which would be a proof that people wanted the product of Verizon, and that just took the whole company's eyes off that short-term view of, oh no, how much profit are we getting out the door this month, next week, this quarter? And Verizon, of course, is a very good example there of how that, I think, just reorients and changes the paradigm within the company. I think also just a final thought on metrics. Bonuses are a big thing, of course, in the corporate world. And I think too many bonuses are tied to short-term wins. And I think we could rethink our whole bonus culture in two ways, carrot and stick, I would say. On the carrot side, you have bonuses that are tied to longer term goals, bigger goals that look beyond this year, before, and may even be beyond. You may even get a bonus after you've left the company, right? Tied to work you did that was longer term in the present, so that people are just constantly thinking that I've got more time to play with here. We as the group, as a company, have more time to work with, to play with, and to thrive with. So reorienting, reshaping the bonus structure, I think would be important. And then where does the stick come in? I think clawing back bonuses, right? Where it turns out in the medium term that what looked great in the short term, actually in the medium term turned out to be not so great or even bad or possibly criminal. I claw it back, right? We don't see enough of that as well. So I think a bit of a carrot stick reinvention of metrics can possibly help on that front too.
Yeah. Thanks, Carl. I'm going to take you now. You spoke about Elon Musk, and when you spoke with Kathy, you were also mentioning, the Silicon Valley and how the pressure there, innovation, be first to market. It's that's what's going to give you your competitive advantage. It's what's going to make you break through. So how do you rationalize that with this, drive to be slow
What came up earlier, of course, is that slow doesn't mean slow motion and everything. You always arrive last and everything moves really slowly. No, it's about slow with a capital S, about the right speed. It's about what musicians call the tempo giusto, right? The right tempo. So that means that sometimes you've got turbo, but other times you're tortoise, right? So you're picking the right moments. You're picking the sweet spot timing wise. And it's important to imagine, I think, with that first mover advantage is often overblown, right? I mean, there are many of the behemoths of today, like Google, Facebook, even TikTok, Instagram. These were not necessarily the first people to the party, right? Apple doesn't, the iPhone was not the first smartphone, but I think many of us, for a while, it probably was the best. Another example, Airbnb. Craigslist was the first one to try and do short-term rentals, but Airbnb has become the go-to company. So this idea that, and it comes from the culture, right? We're just constantly bombarded by this idea that faster is better and first always wins. First does not always win in business, right? Sometimes it pays to hold back, to get your proverbial ducks in a row, to get the product or the service bang on, get it right, then go to market, right? Or maybe even hold back. Maybe you want to wait 6 weeks, who knows? But this idea that it's faster is always better is utterly toxic and totally preposterous, right? It's not borne out by the facts. So I think that's something that, as I don't know if you're thinking as a coach or somebody is just to bring those stories to people's attention and get them to try experiments, right? It doesn't have to be the whole company has to be a slow company next week, but maybe you try one division or one team, embraces slow as a pilot project for a month or for this piece of development, and then see how it works at the end. Just test it out. You don't have to go all in on slow. Find your way as a company, find your way as an entrepreneur, test things out, iterate in the Silicon Valley way. And I think if you do that wisely with an open mind, you're going to come to the conclusion that slower is often better. even in
I,
corporate world.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love this idea of the stories, and I love this idea of testing and trying. And it's you talk about the importance of varying your speed and tempo giusto. That means you actually sometimes have to pause to say what is the right tempo,
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we're
Yeah.
so into the treadmill that sometimes we even forget to pause. And Carl, you mentioned the iPhone. Now, In Praise of Slow, if I remember correctly, was published actually 3 years before the first iPhone. And when I read the book, I just, things were bad then. And then keeping on with your music analogy, it's been a crescendo of acceleration since then. Today's people, I find that people's level of distraction and always being connected by different mediums is as off the charts, as you've mentioned. And with COVID, things have gotten even worse, to the point where some of my clients, the firms are actually mandating their employees to have, time off for mental health reasons. They're mandating, you cannot send emails after this hour. You can't, they're actually making it. So what's your assessment of the current workplace environment and how?
Yeah, well, my assessment is that it's a mixed picture. I mean, and with any new technology, the same thing always happens. We swing way out to one extreme, and it takes a while to come back to the middle and work out the norms and the cultural rules that are going to get the most out of it. I think before the pandemic, we were already starting to see a move away from this idea that being always on was a good thing for human beings or for businesses or for both. So you already had companies like Volkswagen, which had tweaked their servers so most staff couldn't send emails outside working hours. That was so successful that others like, IBM and Puma followed suit. France passed a law giving the rights to disconnect from the office electronically to people in, larger companies. Ireland passed a similar law last month. The UK is talking about it now. You mentioned companies that have, through the pandemic, probably thought, oh, it's great, our staff are online all the time, and then realized that their staff were making mistakes, burning out, so they're having to step in. So the tectonic plates, I think, are starting to shift back in the right direction. There's still a long way to go, but I think that we're learning, right? We're fumbling our way through the darkness and coming out the other end. And I mean, I see more and more examples of it. One of my favorite ones was from an entrepreneur I met just before the pandemic, actually. And he said to me, he said, 5 years ago, I was just on the verge of a total breakdown. I couldn't switch off my phone. I was looking at it all the time. I was getting up in the middle of the night and my holidays. My health was suffering. My wife hated me. My company was dying. And he said, I decided I had to slow down. I had to switch off. So what he did was he started going on vacation and not looking at his email at all, right? But he'd send out an automatic reply. And the reply, he still says it now. He says, the reply says, thanks for writing to me, and I'll get back to you when I return on Thursday. But if you need, if your appointment is, this matter is super important, urgent, write the same email back to me again, send it again to me, but at a different address. And the address he puts is ruinmyvacation@yahoo.com. And he said,
I love it.
He said to me, in 5 years, no one has written to that address. No one. And I've received thousands of emails on my vacation. And in that time, I've never missed out on a work deal or broken a contract or lost a client. I've got my health back. My wife likes me again, and my company is thriving. So, that's one example of someone who's working out how to put speed limits on the information superhighway. And it's going to happen many, many times at the micro individual level. But you're also seeing, as we've just kicked around some examples now, of big companies and even whole nations saying, whoa, we got to draw some lines in the sand here. So I think we're going to see more of that.
Yeah, I humor is important, I think.
Always.
Humor is important. I actually find sometimes that this might not be a new phenomenon, but it must be historic in human nature, is that sometimes our speed is such that it's accelerated by emotion. There's times when we can get hijacked by our emotions, and in business context, for example, and that you fire off that email.
Fight or flight.
The fight or flight, the amygdala is going full blast, and I mentioned before pressing pause, and for me it's something that I personally struggle with, that I've been working with to sort of, and your book has helped in that regard. But what would you say to leaders and to business people in terms of when the emotions are high, how to press that pause button, to take another perspective, to look at your overall purpose, to have a more nuanced approach, to not to fire off that email.
Yeah. Well, one thing I've seen work in companies really well is having a kind of pause moment, right? I mean, I was working with a sort of investment company in London where they found that people were just shooting from the hip, right? As you say, fight or flight, making mistakes, bad decisions, sending off emails that were alienating clients and stuff. And they said, we need to get people to slow down. So they introduced a Tibetan bowl, right? Which, if you're in a meeting or something and someone felt a bit rough, they would just kind of ring the bowl, right? And just people could take, 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds just to pause and then go back into the fray, with the amygdala back in balance and, calm. So I'm not saying everyone has to have a Tibetan bowl, but some kind of tell or some kind of tick or some kind of lever you pull that just allows you to insert a moment of pause and reflection. You dial down the temperature, you take down the excitement. There's also the 2-minute rule, which I think works really well for email, because they've shown that if we pause for 2 minutes to think about a question or a problem or something, it turns out that 2 minutes is enough to get past a lot of those biases, like confirmation bias, all those things that lead us into going for low-hanging fruit and making bad decisions and quick fixes. So 2 minutes, right? So if you're confronted at work by a hugely important, tricky, awkward email, you think, take 2 minutes, like walk around the office for a couple of minutes and then come back. Abraham Lincoln had a practice. This is way before the iPhone, obviously. When he wrote a very angry letter, he would never send it on the day. He would always put it in a drawer by his bed at night and sleep on it, and then get up in the morning and reread the letter. And if he thought, this stands up to scrutiny in the light of day, he'd send it. Otherwise, and he said very often, otherwise it didn't. He'd rip it up and start again, right? So just those little pause moments, doesn't have to be overnight. Sometimes 2 minutes can be enough. Sometimes 30 seconds of just deep breathing can help you reset your body, your mind, so you don't fall into that trap.
Carl, thank you so much. I not only loved your talk here about business, but what you said it with Kathy in terms of like now getting into my head. My kids are just either going to Harvard or having to wear hoodies and heroin. So that's a relief. But there is a third way. There is another way, and I know I really, kidding aside, I find that it's a breath of fresh air, and I look forward to reading your book on the education and parenting. I think it's just wonderful. Thank you very much for all.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting. Thank you.
Merci Hélène Antoniou, très éclairant aussi. Alors je retiens 2 minutes avant de répondre à un mail, à un courriel, c'est bien, on va appliquer cette règle et puis peut-être le temps de réflexion d'Abraham Lincoln va nous inspirer, aussi le temps long du 19e siècle, un peu réintroduit. Troisième arrêt maintenant, la culture, mais la sphère privée aussi, domestique, je dirais, en tout cas certainement personnelle. On a abordé un peu par la bande ces sujets forcément en ce qui concerne le monde des affaires et le monde de l'éducation. Donc là, on y va hardiment avec William Saint-Hilaire. William Saint-Hilaire, gestionnaire chevronné ayant œuvré plus de 20 ans au sein d'organismes culturels et de charité. Elle est claveciniste de formation et l'auteur de plusieurs livres. Elle œuvre dans le milieu de la culture depuis nombre d'années. Elle a été notamment chef des communications à Radio-Canada pendant plus d'une décennie. Elle est présidente, directrice générale et directrice artistique de la Fondation Metropolis Bleu depuis 10 ans maintenant. Elle est aussi compagne de l'Ordre des arts et des lettres du Québec. William Saint-Hilaire, Carl Honoré, c'est à vous.
Bonjour, écoutez, on est tellement content de vous avoir au festival avec nous. Mon livre de chevet, le voici, vous le connaissez bien.
Ah, voici l'édition française, super.
Et je le lis, je le relis constamment. Une chose qui m'a beaucoup, comme disait Marie, je vais vous amener un petit peu plus dans le secteur de la santé personnelle, des états d'âme, des quêtes spirituelles qui moi, m'intéressent, m'animent beaucoup. Vous avez bien gentiment partagé dans les premières pages les bons conseils du docteur Wu. Je ne sais pas si je le prononce bien. Il semble-t-il que vous vouliez aller vite avec vos mots d'eau. Alors, je voulais vous entendre parce que je trouvais que c'était... On est tous pris avec un bobo qu'on n'arrive pas à guérir. On veut aller vite. Et je me suis dit, tiens, je vais lui demander. Et qu'en est-il du docteur Wu?
Le fameux docteur Wu. Oui, mot bobo, j'ai eu des maux de dos depuis l'adolescence. Et pendant beaucoup d'années, je cherchais constamment parce que j'étais pressé, c'était un problème d'impatience. Alors, je cherchais des solutions express, des remèdes de miracle. Je prenais des pilules. J'ai essayé des techniques californiennes. Je suis même allé visiter une sorcière brésilienne pour me guérir. Et à un moment donné, je me suis trouvé dans le studio de Dr. Wu, qui il était encore un expert en acupuncture. Et il m'a fait un traitement. Et à la fin de l'heure de traitement, je lui ai dit, oh, je me sens un peu mieux. Il m'a recommandé de réserver un autre traitement, de faire une série de traitements de 5 ou 6 heures. Et je lui ai dit, bon, je ne sais pas, on verra. Parce que c'était un peu mon mode d'emploi, hein, c'était de trouver une solution miracle. Et puis, peut-être ça marchait pendant une demi-heure ou deux semaines, puis le problème me revenait. Et il m'a regardé de front, il m'a dit, vous n'allez jamais vous guérir. Vous allez toujours avoir ce problème parce que vous êtes un homme pressé. Et je l'ai regardé j'étais tellement surpris et étonné et j'avais honte aussi parce que à ce moment-là, j'étais déjà le gourou mondial du mouvement slow. J'avais écrit Éloge de l'enteur, je voyageais un peu partout dans le monde où je préconisais le mouvement slow et voici, je me trouvais devant un médecin qui avait bien raison. Je me suis rendu compte que j'avais perdu la boussole, la tête. Et je suis revenu 2 semaines plus tard et j'ai fait le traitement les 6 traitements. Et j'ai continué à chercher des solutions plus à long terme comme le pilates, etc. Et ça va bien, le dos. Ça va bien, le dos. Ouais.
Et un autre élément de votre livre qui m'intéressait, c'est tout l'impact, dans le fond, de la vitesse sur la santé mentale. Même mes collègues, nos invités en ont parlé, vous ont posé des questions plus au niveau de l'éducation et tout ça, mais le slow et puis le flow aussi, la notion de pouvoir se concentrer, rentrer dans une occupation de soit de bricolage, de cabane à moineaux ou alors de tout ce qui demande, et particulièrement chez les adolescents qui sont pas du tout là-dedans, qui sont très fragmentés, qui jouent aux jeux vidéo, qui sont sur Facebook, Instagram et tout ça. Est-ce que vous avez des statistiques en poche? Est-ce que vous avez des idées à nous suggérer pour que nos ados soient plus zen, se retrouvent un petit peu plus dans des moments de calme? Et qu'est-ce qu'on fait, nous, quand on a ces jeunes gens à la maison? Les miens ont 25 et 26, là, mais je vois les mêmes patterns. Ils bougent comme des girouettes tout le temps. Alors, est-ce que c'est généralisé? Est-ce que ça va se calmer après le COVID ou on va apprendre à vivre avec ça?
Il y a beaucoup de questions là-dedans. La première, c'était la santé mentale. Hein? Oui. Je suis complètement d'accord qu'il y a un lien très fort entre la lenteur et la santé mentale, la santé physique, et c'est le lien corps-âme, non? C'est corps-esprit. Hein? L'être humain a besoin de moments de réflexion, de tisser les liens avec les autres, de recharger les batteries, moments de sérénité et de tranquillité. Et c'est quelque chose qu'on a sacrifié sur l'autel de la vitesse, de la stimulation, de la distraction. Et on paye un prix très élevé, très haut. Hein. C'est pour ça que souvent, la dernière étape avant un burn-out, avant un épuisement, c'est une dernière accélération. C'est comme si la personne essayait de s'échapper des problèmes. Parce que la vitesse, une vie d'épuisement, de distraction, etc., d'être super occupé. Pour beaucoup de choses, c'est un genre un mécanisme de déni, d'éviter des grandes questions. Qui suis-je? Quel est le sens de ma vie? Quel est mon objectif, etc. Et ça, c'est le secret pour une vie bien vécue, pour une vie digne du nom. C'est avoir des moments de réflexion, parce que c'est une culture obsédée par la réaction. Et le slow, un grand bienfait du slow, du mouvement slow, la slow attitude, c'est récupérer l'art de la réflexion. Et je pense que ça, c'est quelque chose qui nous mène à une santé mentale plus ça aide, non, à la santé mentale. Et on voit ça chez les enfants surtout, que si on regarde les statistiques, des problèmes d'attention, le manque d'attention, ils ont du mal à se concentrer, ils ont du mal à dormir. C'est tout lié, à mon avis, c'est tout lié à cette existence hyper accélérée, hyper stimulée. Alors, et vous avez parlé un peu de la bonne heure. Je pense que il y a aussi un lien là aussi que le slow, qu'est-ce que ça nous apporte? Pour moi, au fond, le slow, c'est un état d'esprit, c'est une mentalité, c'est être présent dans le moment actuel, c'est vivre pleinement, c'est oublier l'horloge, oublier le passage du temps. Et ça, c'est le flow aussi, c'est être complètement présent dans l'activité du moment, dans le moment. Et pour moi, le slow, ça rime avec flow et c'est pas du tout étonnant parce que c'est pas exactement deux côtés de la même médaille, mais il y a des liens clairs. Alors, troisième ou quatrième question, c'était les enfants et les ados. Il faut pas perdre l'espoir, comme non, je vais pas parler il y a un rituel qui existe maintenant. Je sais pas si ça existe au Canada. J'ai l'impression que non. Mais un nouveau rituel social qui s'appelle le stacking, et on voit souvent à Londres ou à New York, quand les jeunes, les ados sortent, ils vont prendre un café ou manger du sushi ou quoi que ce soit. Ils sont tous assis autour de la table. Et stacking, comme empiler en français, non? Ils empilent leur portable au centre, au milieu de la table. Et celui qui prend le premier son portable pour regarder Instagram, paye l'addition de tout le monde. Et c'est juste un petit geste, un petit rituel rigolo, non, qui souligne le fait que nous avons ce moment ensemble. On n'aura jamais ce moment de nouveau. Pourquoi le gâcher en essayant d'être dans 2 ou 3 autres moments en même temps? Et ça, c'est un rituel créé par la génération. C'est quoi la génération? Z ce sont les jeunes. C'est pas les baby boomers qui ont imposé ça. Alors pour moi, ça me donne beaucoup d'espoir. C'est le fait que ces jeunes, ils ont les mêmes besoins qu'un enfant né aujourd'hui à Montréal aura les mêmes besoins qu'un enfant né il y a 50 ans, 50 ans avant l'invention des réseaux sociaux. Ils ont besoin des moments de tranquillité, même d'ennui. On a tellement peur de l'ennui, mais l'ennui peut être la clé qui ouvre la porte à la créativité, à l'invention, à la réflexion. Alors, la dernière question, c'était qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Le comment. Moi, j'anime un programme de télévision en Australie qui s'appelle Frantic Family Rescue. C'est comment sauver la famille frénétique. Alors, je dois aider des ados comme ça. Et pour moi, c'est toujours une question de remplacement, de remplacer ce qu'ils ont maintenant. Alors, pas question de leur quitter le iPhone, prendre l'iPhone et le laisser à leurs propres ressources, parce qu'ils ont perdu, les muscles sont devenus faibles, les muscles de jeu libre, de l'invention, de la découverte personnelle. Ces muscles-là sont devenus faibles. Alors, il faut remplacer ces moments d'écran avec des moments plutôt slow, des moments tactiles, des moments du monde réel. On va dessiner ensemble, on va cuisiner quelque chose ensemble, on va simplement jouer ensemble, on va prendre une marche ensemble, etc. Alors, remplacer ces moments de vitesse avec des moments de lenteur à court terme, et après, au fil des semaines, les muscles vont récupérer la force et vont pouvoir jouer et utiliser leur temps sans avoir à constamment chercher un écran ou une distraction électronique.
J'avais une dernière question qui concernait un peu la consommation rapide. Alors, j'ai lu un truc de Regina Wong, Faites de la place. Et d'ailleurs, elle vous mentionne, puis elle a l'air d'être une fan finie et tout. Et donc, le decluttering, le slow, on voit que les plus jeunes semblent vouloir moins consommer ou consommer plus local, mais
Ouais.
en opposition à cette capacité d'acheter en tout temps et très rapidement, on n'a pas fini de commander quelque chose en ligne, que ça sonne à la porte. Je voulais vous entendre là-dessus parce que tout ça me semble bien lié. Si on achète trop, on passe notre temps à réparer des machins, on peste parce qu'on n'a pas le temps, parce que les machins sont brisés. Donc, comment on sort de ça?
C'est très lié. En fait, la consommation va ensemble avec la rapidité, la culture fast. Ce que les jeunes cherchent de plus en plus, ce sont les expériences. Ils veulent avoir des expériences. Et on entend ça souvent, non? Dans les sondages, dans les études, etc. Et les expériences vont avec la lenteur. On peut pas, ça n'a aucun sens accélérer une expérience. L'expérience se vit. C'est quelque chose qu'on doit expérimenter, on doit plonger dedans avec un esprit slow. La consommation, on peut toujours l'accélérer. On peut toujours consommer de plus en plus et de plus en plus rapidement. Alors là, comme début, ça explique un peu où on est rendu. Pour nombre d'entre nous aussi, la consommation est une manière de s'échapper de nous-mêmes, hein, nous échapper de nous-mêmes. C'est pour ne pas faire face aux grandes questions dont je parlais tout à l'heure. Là. C'est au lieu de se poser la question, est-ce que je vis la vie correcte et pour moi, non, c'est plus facile. Est-ce que je peux trouver ça un peu moins cher sur Amazon? Et quand est-ce que ce produit va arriver chez moi? Ce sont des questions banales, mais ce sont les questions qui nous remplissent le cerveau et l'esprit. Et ça nous permet d'éviter de faire les devoirs métaphysiques et existentiels que nous devons faire pour vivre pleinement. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire pour s'en sortir, pour éviter ce culte de la consommation? C'est des petits pas. C'est toujours quand on parle du ralentissement, d'embrasser la philosophie slow, à mon avis, c'est toujours un processus de petits pas. Et le problème aujourd'hui, c'est qu'on est tellement impatient qu'on a envie de ralentir rapidement. Alors, pour les gens, ils entendent parler, ils disent « Ah, j'ai envie de retrouver ma tortue intérieure. Ils vont faire un peu de yoga, ils vont courir pour faire un peu de méditation. » Ça ne va pas marcher comme ça. Ça ne marchera pas comme ça, non? C'est une question de faire d'expérimenter, d'essayer, d'avancer un pas et peut-être retourner un autre pas le lendemain. Mais de faire des petits projets, des petits gestes. Et on parlait de la consommation. Peut-être avoir 3 jours par semaine libre d'Amazon. Pas d'Amazon 3 jours par semaine. Je dis 3 jours, ça peut être 2 jours, 1 jour, 4 jours, ça dépend de la personne, ça dépend du contexte. Et faire comme une expérience et après voir comment ça a été, est-ce que j'ai peut-être acheté un peu moins, est-ce que j'ai été un peu plus présent ces jours-là dans ma vie réelle, non virtuelle, parce que je n'avais pas l'occasion de chercher un autre produit, un autre achat sur Amazon. Alors ça, c'est un exemple. Mais à mon avis, c'est de mettre l'emphase, comme le fait cette nouvelle génération, sur les expériences, parce que les expériences ne peuvent pas s'accélérer. Même le grand système économique qui a toujours envie de nous pousser à dépenser de plus en plus ne pourra jamais accélérer les expériences. C'est fou, c'est dingue, ça n'a aucun sens. Alors, les expériences peuvent être comme une vaccination, pour utiliser une métaphore du moment, contre le virus de la consommation et le virus de la hâte.
Donc, aller à la pêche et lire des livres. Ça va nous faire bien.
Mais pas la même fois.
Non, pas
c'est ça, parce que c'était un principe. C'est que comme la pierre angulaire du mouvement slow, c'est faire une chose à la fois.
À la fois.
Éviter le multitâche et le multitasking, parce que c'est un faux Dieu, hein, c'est un calice empoisonné.
Absolument. Merci beaucoup. C'est très, très intéressant.
Merci à vous.
Merci, William Saint-Hilaire. J'ai envie de poser une question. Ce n'était pas prévu, mais prérogative de l'animatrice, puisque vos propos étaient inspirants tous. Ma question, c'est très simple. ralentir l'esprit slow, on va dire, est-il un luxe finalement ou à la portée de tous, quel que soit son mode de vie, quelle que soit sa condition sociale? Parce qu'on pense au personnel des hôpitaux en ce moment, on pense à plein de gens qui vivent sous la pression. Est-ce à la portée de chacun par des micro-gestes finalement?
Des micro-gestes sont à la portée de chacun, oui, tout à fait. Et même les infirmières qui travaillent 35 heures par jour en ce moment
Et
peuvent
plus, oui.
trouver
Ouais.
un petit créneau là pour s'ils terminent de travailler, au lieu de se lancer directement aux réseaux sociaux, de se prendre 2 minutes de recul ou 5 minutes pour se promener dans le quartier ou n'importe où. Il y a toujours quelque chose qu'on peut faire pour ralentir. Et c'est la même chose avec la gastronomie ou la cuisine. Le slow food, souvent, est vu comme des banquets de truffes, des grands vins de Bourgogne. Non, ça c'est une manifestation, une expression du slow food. Slow food peut être aussi une pâte très simple, faite maison, avec la famille autour de la table, avec les portables éteints. Alors ça, devrait être à la portée de tout le monde. Évidemment, avoir des ressources économiques, ça nous donne certains avantages, ça c'est inévitable. Et à mon avis, à long terme, un des objectifs du slow movement, du mouvement slow, c'est de créer une société plus juste, avec une distribution plus juste des ressources. Mais ça, c'est un projet plutôt de long terme.
Ouais. Merci, Carl Honoré. En tout cas, cette société plus juste, nous l'appelons de tous nos voeux, je crois, toutes celles et vous ici réunis. Donc, Carl Honoré, Catherine Nikidis, Hélène Antoniou, William Saint-Hilaire, je vous remercie de vous être livrés à cet exercice que les spectateurs auront certainement apprécié. J'invite le public à se procurer les livres dont on a parlé, là, les titres qu'on a mentionnés donc au cours de cet échange sur le site de nos libraires partenaires. Donc, in English, www.paragraph.com, www.paragraph.com et en français, www.librairiegallimard.com, c'est notre librairie partenaire. Aussi, j'invite le public à assister aux autres rendez-vous de la programmation du printemps du Festival Metropolis bleu. Tous les détails sur notre site. Bonne continuation. Dans mes échanges avec Carl Honoré pour préparer cette rencontre, souvent il signait par un adverbe lentement. Alors, je le reprends à mon compte. Au lieu de cordialement, il signait lentement. Je le reprends à mon compte, à notre compte à tous, lentement. Voilà. Merci.
Merci. Au revoir.